In the 1500s, corn found its way to the continent of Africa, and it's never been the same. Corn is an amazing plant, but it also has a dark side that most people don't know about. Corn was introduced to the continent of Africa around or after the year 1500. You see, once Atlantic trade routes opened up, plants like cassava, beans, potatoes, and corn that had never been to the African continent were brought there as a part of the back and forth trading that was happening. Before corn, people were more interested in eating the traditional African grains like sorghum and millet. One of the earliest written references that we have to the corn plant in the continent of Africa was from the year 1540, when an explorer reported its widespread cultivation on the Cape Verde Islands.
At the beginning of August, they begin to sow grain, which they call zaburo, or in the West Indies, maize. It is like chickpea and grows all over these islands and along the West African coast, and is the chief food of the people.
It gradually spread over the rest of the continent, reaching southern Africa by the mid-1600s. As I mentioned, Africans didn't necessarily need corn. They already had plenty indigenous grains that mostly met their needs. We can actually tell by the names that were given to the corn plant in different parts of the continent of Africa that most of them didn't see it as something indigenous. For example, in Ethiopia, Semitic speakers called it Yabaher Mashela, which means the sorghum from the sea. In Malawi, people who speak Chichua called it Chimanga, literally means from the coast, which indicates that they think of it as being something foreign. On the East African coast, Kiswahili speakers would have called it Mohindi, which means the grain of India. In other East African languages, corn was called Pemba, which is actually the same name as the island where the Portuguese used to grow food to feed their own soldiers. But wait, there's more language evidence that corn is not indigenous to the continent. For example, Kikongo speakers called corn Mazamamputo, which literally translates to grain of the white man. People from Senegambia who spoke Mande called it Tuba Nyo, which means a white man's grain. Akan speakers use the word aburo to refer to corn, but they also describe overseas countries as aburokiere, which literally means countries where corn comes from. But how did corn actually arrive on the continent in the first place? You see, in some West African languages, corn is called maka, and historians use this to justify the theory that corn first landed in the areas north of the continent of Africa, then made its way south and west with the people who were returning to the continent from their Islamic pilgrimages. But there is also another route. You see, early on when the Portuguese had near monopoly control over the trading routes across the Atlantic, they also introduced Brazilian varieties of maize to the continent. In West Africa, corn was accepted because it was an excellent complement to what they were already doing. In the dry areas, it was a benefit because it was something that you could grow quickly with low labor while you wait for your longer maturing, more indigenous plants to fully mature. It was more of a complement than a replacement. On the other side of the continent, though, where the Ethiopians were, they never fully adopted it in the same way. They more kept it as a casual crop, never fully looking into it as a full-scale field crop until about the 20th century, hundreds of years after it was first introduced. Why? They had their own thing going on, their own indigenous grains. One of the areas where the impact of corn was most pronounced was in the development and settlement of the Upper Guinea Forest area on the west side of Africa. Here's the logic behind it. If you're going to develop a densely forested area into home base for a kingdom or a state, you need access to a whole lot of human labor. We're talking about clearing thousands of tons of bush and debris from an area in order to maintain it and prepare it to be settled by humans. Specifically, they had to do two things. Firstly, there was a high forest canopy of vegetation that blocked sunlight from penetrating to the crops that they would grow at ground level. They had to figure out how to clear that. Secondly, they had to figure out how to keep this up and manage it to prevent that vegetation from regrowing, choking sunlight from the crops that they grew at ground level, and thus preventing the development of their human settlement. In terms of food options, first off, they had access to wild yams and other tubers. food that grows under the ground, but the problem is they were scarce. The next options would have been the more traditional African staples like sorghum and millet. These, though, took a longer time to mature, and also they required more sunlight. And if you think about a densely forested area, a lot of the sunlight is hindered from reaching the forest floor by the heavy canopy of trees that exists, making those plants perhaps unsuitable at the moment. Because of the thick sunlight and vegetation, the plants that were most suitable are the ones that would grow the highest and have the most reasonable labor requirements relative to the amount of carbs and calories that the harvest would provide. It's a crazy example of how two things intersect. On one hand, you have the corn plant being introduced to the continent because the Portuguese use it as a food source for their army. On the other hand, it intersects with human efforts to develop the upper Dine forest area. It kicks off what they call the Carbohydrate revolution. People of West Africa lean into the opportunity created by the introduction of the corn as a food source. They quickly incorporated corn into their indigenous African cultivation systems and used it to their benefit. I'll spare you the details, but they have 2 rainy seasons. They would incorporate corn into the activities of the first rainy season. This allowed them to have an extra second harvest in addition to what they would normally have before the introduction of corn. By increasing their ability to feed people, corn had a huge influence on the expansion of the state and economic growth of the kingdoms that existed there. First, it made sure that the Asante army had a transportable, reliable forest-based food supply because they continued to expand their reach into the regions around. Farmers developed techniques that allowed them to adapt corn to the drier environments where they lived. And slowly over time, the new crop started to replace sorghum and millet. By the middle of the 20th century, farmers in places like northern Ghana had bred local corn into all kinds of varieties that were perfectly suitable for their farming systems and unique physical environments. Corn had been fully embedded into the world of West Africa. Meanwhile, in Ethiopia, corn was also embedding itself in the Ethiopian and East African economy, just in a different way. The Ethiopians had long had their own classic assortment of grains and plants that they grow to meet their specific needs. This includes things like barley, teff, wheat, sorghum, and something called eleusine. When corn arrived, the Ethiopian farmers accepted it and included it. It never took a primary role. They still focused on their traditional crops. This changed as they moved into the early 20th century because the coffee export market was starting to boom. What most farmers did was to integrate coffee and corn in a way that complemented each other. Coffee exporting is big business, but while they wait for the coffee to grow, to harvest so that they can export it, they would use corn as an intermediate stopgap. Because it grows fast and has lower labor requirements, they would use that as a source of food and to get some cash in the meantime while you wait for the coffee to grow so that you can harvest it and export it. This also worked well for farmers who didn't necessarily have the labor to grow coffee on their own land. They would work for other coffee farmers, helping them grow coffee, and then grow corn on their own land so that they would have something to tide them over, cash crop, while they wait for the real coffee harvest to arrive. This complementary organic system worked really well for the Ethiopians. This continued until the Ethiopian Socialist Revolution. This occurred from approximately 1974 to 1991. You see, during the socialist government era, the government controlled the prices of food for the most part. There was one plant, though, that was exempt from food-controlled prices, and that was corn, partially because it wasn't a prestigious plant. Corn at that time was actually the cheapest and least marketable of all the food crops that Ethiopia produced. By 1980, coffee prices started to fall, and as a way to avoid the government control over coffee pricing, farmers started to lean more heavily into corn production. It was a sleeper crop, one that the government wasn't necessarily interested in regulating heavily. Gradually, corn started to replace other plants like sorghum. Additionally, chat, which is a narcotic plant which had lucrative markets in places like Somalia and Yemen, also served as a nice complement to corn. Gradually, the farmers would move over from cultivating coffee and corn to instead growing chat and corn. They still complemented each other, but they flew under the radar and were not under the control of the government. This was also compounded by the fact that forced labor was a thing under the government of Ethiopia at the time. They would conscript labor to do things like build roads, etc. Corn became even more appealing because it's a high-carb, decent-calorie, fairly nutritious food source that could survive without having a whole lot of labor to plow, maintain, and harvest it. Here's the thing though, don't believe me. Let's look at the numbers. In 1970 and 1971, corn was about 15% of the national cereal production of Ethiopia. As they moved into the era of socialism in 1983 and 1984, at the height of a famine, and after about 10 years of the socialist policies, corn was about 28% of all cereals grown in Ethiopia. As time moved on from 86 to 91, it went from 32 to 48% of total cereal production. By the time the Ethiopians were deep into the 90s, corn was the absolute #1 most produced crop in their country. In less than 100 years, corn had gone from something that was undesirable to the top cereal produced in the entire country of Ethiopia. Corn is still one of the primary food sources for over 300 million people in the sub-Saharan region of Africa. It's popular, easy to grow, and extremely versatile in terms of the amount of things that can be made from it. There's still some problems to solve though. Number one, corn is a thirsty plant. No, I don't know if you believe in climate change or not, but whatever you believe, rainfall patterns, if they're not consistent, can easily wreak havoc on a corn crop. For the most part, corn production in sub-Saharan Africa is fed by rain, not irrigation. This means unexpected changes in rainfall patterns or water supply can actually overturn months of investment in corn production. Additionally, corn has heavy nutrient requirements. It requires lots of fertilizer, and land that is used to grow corn needs a fair amount of recovery time because the corn essentially strips it of its nutrients. Here's another thing that's been recently discovered. In black South Africans, there are almost epidemic rates of what they call squamous carcinoma of the esophagus. In layman's terms, throat cancer, a throat cancer epidemic. We've recently learned that this epidemic is caused because of a fungus that grows on the corn plant. It's called the Fusarium fungus. This fungus, through a series of complicated chemical processes, creates nitrosamines, which are carcinogens. Black South Africans are exposed to these carcinogens through their consumption of traditional beer, which is made with, well, you guessed it by now, it's made with corn. No, it's not that corn is bad per se. It's more that after corn was introduced to the continent of Africa, the events of life happened in such a way that they may have created an over-reliance on this crop. It's true that at this point, corn is inseparable from many parts of the African experience. It also has decent nutritional value, which is arguably very important for one of the fastest growing regions of the world. While we can't change history, one of the best things we can do is acquaint ourselves with it so that we can put everything in its proper perspective. Corn feeds many parts of the continent, and its history is undeniable. If you didn't know, now you know.